The sound of jet engines screaming overhead at 300 feet should have been routine for Sarah Michelle Parker. After all, she'd been teaching basic flight instruction at Pine Ridge Regional Airport for 15 years. But as the Navy F-A-18 Super Hornet banked sharply over the Montana mountains, something inside her chest tightened like a vice. Her hands, steady enough to guide nervous student pilots through their first solo flights, began to tremble against the coffee cup she'd been holding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through the windows of the Flight Academy's modest control tower, she watched the sleek fighter jet circle back toward their small civilian airstrip. Emergency landing, the radio had crackled 20 minutes earlier. Technical difficulties requiring immediate ground support. What the Navy pilots didn't know was that their chosen emergency landing site was staffed by someone who understood their aircraft better than they could possibly imagine. Sarah set down her coffee and walked toward the radio console, her worn leather flight jacket hanging loose over shoulders that had once carried 60 pounds of tactical gear through hostile territory. The other instructors at Rocky Mountain Flight Academy saw her as dependable but unremarkable. A competent teacher who helped weekend warriors earn their private pilot licenses and occasionally worked with local teenagers who dreamed of aviation careers they'd probably never afford. Nobody questioned why she never flew the more advanced aircraft available at the airport. Nobody wondered why she seemed content teaching basic maneuvers in 20-year-old Cessnas when her smooth handling suggested she could manage much more sophisticated machines. In Oakville, Montana, population 8,500, people minded their own business and respected others who did the same. The F-A-18 was coming in fast, too fast for a standard civilian approach. Sarah's trained eye caught the slight wobble in the aircraft's descent that indicated hydraulic problems, possibly compounded by electrical issues affecting the flight control systems. Her pulse quickened as muscle memory kicked in, 15 years of careful suppression suddenly fighting against instincts that had once kept her alive in situations most people couldn't imagine. Marcus Thompson burst through the control tower door, his face flushed with the kind of panic that civilian airport managers experienced when military aircraft declared emergencies on their watch. As head flight instructor and Sarah's immediate supervisor, Marcus had handled his share of crisis situations, but nothing involving multi-million-dollar Navy fighters and the potential for catastrophic insurance claims. "Sarah, thank God you're here," Marcus gasped, slightly out of breath from running up the tower stairs. "The Navy boys are requesting our best instructor to coordinate ground support. I told them you've got the most experience with emergency procedures." He paused, studying her face with the concerned expression of someone who'd worked alongside her for over a decade. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah forced her expression into the calm professional mask she'd perfected over 15 years of hiding in plain sight. "I'm fine, Marcus, just focused on getting them down safely." She moved to the radio console with practiced efficiency, though every step felt like walking through quicksand. Her fingers hovered over the transmit button as she considered her options. She could handle this situation with the basic competency expected of a civilian instructor, offering standard ground support while Navy personnel managed their own emergency. Or she could do what every fiber of her being screamed at her to do: take command of the situation with the expertise that had once made her one of the most decorated pilots in Navy SEAL Team 6. The radio crackled with the pilot's voice, steady, but carrying the underlying tension of someone dealing with multiple system failures. "Pine Ridge Tower, this is Navy 274 requesting immediate emergency landing. We've got hydraulic failure, backup electrical systems showing intermittent failures, and fuel situation becoming critical." Marcus grabbed the radio before Sarah could respond. "Navy 274, this is Pine Ridge Tower. We have emergency vehicles standing by, and our runway is clear. What's your estimated time to touchdown? Pine Ridge Tower, we're looking at approximately 8 minutes, but I need to advise we may have difficulties with landing gear deployment. Our hydraulic pressure is dropping faster than anticipated. Sarah watched the aircraft through the tower windows, her trained eye cataloging details that Marcus would never notice. The pilot was compensating for control surface problems by making subtle adjustments to power settings rather than relying on traditional control inputs. Smart adaptation, but it indicated the aircraft's problems were more serious than the radio communication suggested. Without functional hydraulics, landing gear deployment would indeed be problematic, but more critically, the pilot would have limited control authority during the final approach phase. The mathematics of the situation ran through Sarah's mind. With the automatic precision of someone who'd once calculated similar scenarios under combat conditions. Aircraft weight, approach speed, runway length, weather conditions, probable system failures, every variable processed and analyzed in seconds. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Navy pilot was highly skilled, but civilian airport emergency procedures wouldn't be sufficient for this particular combination of system failures. Marcus was coordinating with the airport's volunteer fire department and medical personnel, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone managing a crisis within his area of expertise. But Sarah could hear the limitations in his instructions, the assumptions based on civilian aircraft emergencies, rather than military hardware operating at the edge of its performance envelope. "Marcus," she said quietly, waiting for him to finish. His radio call. "I need to suggest some modifications to the emergency response plan." He looked at her with surprise. In 15 years of working together, Sarah had never contradicted his emergency procedures or offered unsolicited tactical advice. She was competent, reliable, and refreshingly ego-free in a profession that often attracted people with more confidence than skill. Her sudden assertiveness was as unexpected as snow in July. "What kind of modifications?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he was humoring her rather than genuinely seeking her input. Sarah hesitated, feeling the weight of 15 years of careful mediocrity pressing against the knowledge that could save lives. Every instinct told her to maintain her cover, to offer subtle suggestions that might help without revealing the depth of her expertise. But watching the A-18 struggle through its approach pattern, she realized that half measures might not be enough. "The pilot's dealing with more than just hydraulic failure," she said carefully. "Based on his compensation patterns, he's probably lost primary flight control authority and is flying on backup systems that weren't designed for precision approaches. Our standard emergency response assumes he'll be able to control his touchdown point and rollout distance." Marcus stared at her with growing confusion. "Sarah, how do you know about military flight control systems? And what do you mean by compensation patterns?" Before she could answer, the radio crackled again with increased urgency. "Pine Ridge Tower, Navy 274 declaring emergency. Landing gear deployment unsuccessful. We're going to attempt a belly landing. Please advise all emergency personnel and clear any unnecessary traffic from the area." The control tower fell silent except for the steady hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of emergency vehicles positioning themselves around the runway. Through the windows they could see the A-18 beginning its final approach, flying lower and slower than Sarah had ever seen a military aircraft operate. The pilot was displaying remarkable skill, but skill alone wouldn't overcome the physics of landing a disabled fighter jet on a civilian runway designed for aircraft weighing a tenth as much. Marcus reached for the radio to acknowledge the pilot's transmission, but Sarah's hand intercepted his, moving with the quick precision of someone accustomed to split-second decisions under pressure. "Let me talk to him," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that hadn't been present moments earlier. "Sarah, what's gotten into you? You're acting like you've done this before." She looked at him directly, and for the first time in 15 years, Marcus saw something behind her eyes that suggested depths he'd never suspected. "Maybe I have," she said simply, then keyed the radio microphone. "Navy 274, this is Pine Ridge Emergency Coordinator. I'm going to walk you through some modifications to your approach that will help compensate for your control authority." Limitations. The pilot's response came immediately, surprise evident even through the static. "Pine Ridge, are you military qualified? Because I'm dealing with some very specific system configurations here." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling 15 years of careful anonymity slipping away like sand through her fingers. When she opened them, her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who'd once landed damaged aircraft under hostile fire. "Navy 274, unqualified. Trust me, and let's get you on the ground safely." What followed was a conversation that transformed the atmosphere in the control tower from civilian emergency management to something approaching military precision. Sarah guided the Navy pilot through a series of approach modifications that compensated for his aircraft's specific system failures, adjusting for variables that civilian controllers would never consider. Her instructions were technical, precise, and delivered with the kind of calm authority that came from extensive experience with life or death situations. Marcus stood frozen beside the radio console, listening to his mild-mannered flight instructor discuss thrust vector management, angle of attack optimization, and energy management techniques with a level of expertise that seemed impossible. The woman he'd known for 15 years was discussing military aircraft systems with the fluency of someone who'd spent years flying them. "Pine Ridge, your instructions are spot on," the Navy pilot transmitted, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. "I don't know who you are, but you just saved my aircraft and probably my life. These modifications are working perfectly." Through the tower windows, they watched the A-18 execute a textbook belly landing, touching down with remarkable precision despite its disabled landing gear. The aircraft slid down the runway in a controlled manner, emergency foam spraying from airport fire trucks as sparks flew from the aircraft's belly. When it finally came to rest, both pilot and aircraft were intact, though the fighter would require extensive repairs before flying again. Marcus turned to stare at Sarah with an expression mixing awe, confusion, and growing suspicion. "Okay, Sarah, I think it's time you explained exactly how a civilian flight instructor knows advanced military aviation procedures." Sarah remained silent, watching emergency personnel surround the disabled aircraft as the Navy pilot completed his post-crash checklist. Through the radio, they could hear him coordinating with his squadron and requesting military recovery teams. In a few hours, Pine Ridge Regional Airport would be swarming with Navy personnel conducting accident investigations and equipment recovery operations. "Sarah," Marcus pressed, his voice taking on the stern tone he usually reserved for student pilots who'd made dangerous mistakes. "I've worked with you for 15 years. You've never shown any indication that you had military experience, let alone the kind of advanced knowledge you just demonstrated. What aren't you telling me?" She finally turned to face him, and Marcus was startled to see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but the kind of emotional release that came from carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Marcus, there are things about my past that I've never discussed with anyone in Oakville. Things I hoped I'd never have to discuss." She paused, struggling with words that had remained unspoken for 15 years. "But I couldn't let that pilot crash when I had the knowledge to prevent it." Before Marcus could respond, the control tower door burst open again, this time admitting Jake Rodriguez, the Academy's youngest and most ambitious instructor. Jake had been monitoring the emergency from the ground, coordinating with emergency vehicles, but his expression suggested he'd heard enough radio chatter to draw his own conclusions. "Holy shit, Sarah," Jake exclaimed, his usual professional demeanor abandoned in his excitement. "That was incredible. How did you know all that stuff about A-18 systems? I mean, I've got military training, but nothing like what you just demonstrated." Marcus held up a hand to silence Jake's enthusiastic questions. Sarah was just about to explain her background to us. He fixed her with a steady gaze that suggested he wouldn't be satisfied with evasive answers. Sarah walked to the tower windows, looking down at the disabled aircraft surrounded by emergency vehicles and growing crowds of curious airport personnel. In the distance, she could see military vehicles approaching, probably advance teams from the pilot squadron coming to secure their aircraft and begin investigations. 15 years ago, she began slowly, I wasn't Sarah Michelle Parker, civilian flight instructor. I was Lieutenant Sarah Patterson, and I flew missions that officially never happened for a unit that doesn't appear on any organizational charts. The words hung in the air like a confession that changed everything. Marcus and Jake exchanged glances, processing implications they were only beginning to understand. "Navy SEAL Aviation Support," she continued, still watching the activity below. "My job was getting SEAL teams into and out of places where conventional aircraft couldn't operate. Desert installations, mountain compounds, urban environments where stealth and precision were more important than firepower." Jake whistled softly. "SEAL Support Aviation? Sarah, that's like the top 1% of military pilots. Those are some of the most classified missions in the entire military." She nodded without turning around. "It was also where I learned that sometimes being the best at something doesn't protect you from the worst consequences of that expertise." Marcus moved closer, his expression softening as he began to understand that her story involved more than just hidden qualifications. "What happened, Sarah? What made you leave all that behind to teach weekend pilots in Montana?" Sarah was quiet. For a long moment, watching military personnel begin their systematic inspection of the downed aircraft. There was a mission, a rescue operation that went wrong in ways that still give me nightmares. Good people died because of decisions I made, and the aftermath convinced me that I needed to disappear from that world entirely. The radio crackled with a new voice, crisp and authoritative. "Pine Ridge Tower, this is Captain David Mitchell, Squadron Commander for Navy 274. I'm requesting permission to land with the recovery team, and I need to speak with whoever provided ground support for my pilot's emergency landing." Marcus reached for the radio, but Sarah intercepted his hand again, this time with gentle firmness. "Rather than urgency, let me handle this," she said quietly. "If military investigators are coming, they're going to discover my background anyway. Better that I control how much information gets revealed." She keyed the microphone with the resigned expression of someone who'd always known this day would eventually arrive. "Captain Mitchell, this is Pine Ridge Emergency Coordinator. You're cleared for landing on runway 27. Be advised that your pilot executed an excellent emergency procedure and his aircraft suffered minimal damage considering the circumstances. Pine Ridge, I need to commend whoever provided technical guidance during that approach. My pilot says your instructions were better than anything he learned in flight school. I'd like to speak with that person directly." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumbling around her. "Captain Mitchell, that would be me. I'll be available for discussion when you arrive." "Outstanding. What's your background, Pine Ridge?" That level of expertise suggests significant military experience. The question hung in the air like a challenge that demanded honesty. Sarah looked at Marcus and Jake, both watching her with expressions of supportive curiosity rather than judgment. After 15 years of hiding, she was about to step back into a world she'd thought she'd left forever. "Captain Mitchell, we'll discuss my qualifications when you arrive. Pine Ridge. Tower clear." As she set down the microphone, Sarah realized that her quiet life as a civilian flight instructor was over. Within hours, her true identity would be discovered. Her past would be investigated, and the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for 15 years would be stripped away. But for the first time since that terrible night 15 years ago, when everything had gone wrong, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten: the satisfaction of using her skills to save lives rather than watching helplessly as good people died because of her decisions. The sound of approaching military aircraft filled the tower as Captain Mitchell's recovery team prepared to land. Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling muscles remember postures they'd held in briefing rooms and command centers where life and death decisions were made by people trained to handle impossible situations. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it. The woman who'd been hiding in plain sight for 15 years was about to reclaim an identity she'd thought was buried forever. Captain David Mitchell's C-130 transport touched down at Pine Ridge Regional Airport with the kind of precision that spoke of thousands of hours flying into austere landing strips around the world. Sarah watched from the control tower as military personnel immediately began establishing a security perimeter around both aircraft, their movements displaying the coordinated efficiency of a well-drilled team, responding to a situation they'd trained for extensively. Marcus stood beside her, still processing the revelation that his long-time colleague possessed expertise that belonged in classified briefing rooms rather than civilian flight instruction. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." His voice carried the weight of 15 years of professional relationship suddenly called into question. "Is there any chance that your presence here, your background, could create problems for this airport or the people who work here?" The question struck at Sarah's deepest fears about the life she'd built in Oakville. For 15 years she'd carefully avoided any situation that might attract attention from military or intelligence agencies. She'd paid taxes under her assumed identity, maintained minimal digital footprint, and deliberately underperformed in any situation that might showcase her true capabilities. The emergency landing had shattered all those precautions in a matter of minutes. "I don't know," she admitted, watching uniformed figures emerge from the transport aircraft. "My discharge was honorable, and I was never charged with any wrongdoing. But there were classified operations involved, and people in Washington who blamed me for mission failures that cost lives." She turned to face Marcus directly. "I never intended for any of this to surface. I thought I could live quietly here, without my past affecting anyone else." Jake Rodriguez had been unusually silent since Sarah's revelation, but now he stepped forward with the intense expression he usually reserved for complex flight planning scenarios. "Sarah, military aviation support for SEAL operations isn't something you just walk away from. Those skills, that level of clearance, the knowledge you demonstrated today, that represents years of specialized training that cost taxpayers millions of dollars." He paused, studying her face carefully. "What aren't you telling us about? Why you left?" Before Sarah could respond, the control tower door opened to admit Tom Bradley. The airport manager, whose usually calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled anxiety. Tom had built Pine Ridge Regional Airport into a modest success story over 2 decades, balancing the needs of local pilots with the economic realities of operating a small civilian facility. Military emergencies and federal investigations represented exactly the kind of complications that could destroy everything he'd worked to create. "Sarah, we need to talk," Tom announced without preamble. "I just got off the phone with our insurance company, and they're asking questions about our emergency response procedures that I can't answer. They want to know why a civilian instructor was providing technical guidance that exceeded standard protocols." His voice carried the strain of someone trying to maintain professional composure while facing potential financial catastrophe. "They're also asking about the qualifications of personnel who were involved in the emergency response." Sarah felt the familiar weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders. Every choice she'd made 15 years ago to protect herself and others was now creating exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd hoped to avoid. "Tom, I provided guidance that prevented a potential catastrophe. The pilot and aircraft are safe, and there was no property damage to airport facilities." "That's not the point," Tom replied, his frustration evident. "The point is that insurance companies investigate unusual incidents, and what happened today was definitely unusual. They're going to want documentation of your qualifications. Training records, certification history, all the things that prove you were authorized to make the decisions you made." Marcus and Jake exchanged meaningful glances as the implications became clear. Sarah's expertise had saved lives and prevented a disaster, but proving her qualifications would require revealing precisely the background she'd spent 15 years concealing. Through the tower windows, they could see military personnel establishing a command post near the disabled A-18, their activity suggesting a thorough investigation rather than simple aircraft recovery. Captain Mitchell emerged from the transport aircraft wearing the kind of expression that suggested he took emergency incidents very seriously, particularly when they involved unexplained expertise from civilian sources. "There's something else," Tom continued, his voice dropping to the tone he used for delivering particularly bad news. "I got a call from County Emergency Management asking about our response procedures. Apparently, someone monitored our radio transmissions during the emergency and reported that our technical guidance exceeded normal civilian capabilities." He looked directly at Sarah with a mixture of concern and growing suspicion. "They're sending an investigator to review our emergency protocols and interview personnel who were involved." Sarah realized that her attempt to help had triggered multiple levels of official scrutiny that would inevitably uncover her true identity. Insurance investigators, county officials, and military personnel would all be asking questions that required answers she couldn't provide without revealing everything she'd worked to conceal. "How long do we have before these investigators arrive?" she asked, already calculating her options for managing the situation. "County investigator will be here tomorrow morning," Tom replied. "Insurance adjuster is flying in from Denver this afternoon. And those Navy people down there are already asking questions about airport personnel and emergency procedures." Jake moved to the windows, observing the military activity below with the keen interest of someone who understood the significance of what he was witnessing. "Sarah, that's a lot of official attention focused on one emergency incident. If you really do have the kind of background you hinted at, maybe it's time to be proactive about controlling the narrative instead of letting investigators discover things on their own." The suggestion made sense, but Sarah had spent 15 years learning to avoid exactly this kind of situation. Proactive disclosure meant accepting that her carefully constructed anonymity was finished, and she wasn't sure she was prepared for the psychological consequences of returning to a world she'd worked so hard to escape. Marcus approached her with the concerned expression of someone who'd watched a colleague struggle with hidden burdens for years without understanding their nature. "Sarah, in 15 years of working together, you've never missed a day, never caused problems, never given me any reason to question your judgment. If you made decisions 15 years ago that you thought were necessary, I'm willing to trust that those decisions made sense at the time." His support meant more than Sarah could express, but it also highlighted how her deception had affected people who considered her a friend. "Marcus, when those investigators start asking questions, they're going to discover that Sarah Michelle Parker didn't exist before 15 years ago. They're going to find gaps in my employment history, inconsistencies in my background, documentation. That doesn't quite add up." She paused, struggling with the weight of confession. "I used legal name change procedures and legitimate identity documentation, but I deliberately obscured my military service to avoid the kind of attention we're about to receive." Tom's expression grew increasingly grim as he processed the implications. "Sarah, Are you telling me that you've been working here under an assumed identity? Because if that's the case, we're looking at potential legal issues that go far beyond insurance investigations. It's not an assumed identity, Sarah clarified quickly. It's my legal name, properly documented and completely legitimate. But I didn't include my military service on employment applications, and I allowed people to make assumptions about my background that weren't entirely accurate. The distinction was important legally, but Sarah recognized that it wouldn't satisfy investigators who discovered the deliberate omissions in her employment history. Military service, particularly at the level she'd achieved, wasn't something that disappeared from official records, and people with her security clearance history were typically monitored throughout their post-service careers. Jake turned from the windows with a thoughtful expression that suggested he'd been analyzing the situation from multiple angles. Sarah, if you were really part of SEAL aviation support, there are probably people in Washington who've been wondering what happened to you for 15 years. Your expertise today just sent up a signal flare that you're alive, well, and still capable of performing at an extremely high level. The observation sent a chill through Sarah's chest as she realized that her radio conversations with the Navy pilot had been recorded and would inevitably be analyzed by people who might recognize her voice, her terminology, or her specific approach to emergency procedures. Voice recognition technology and communication analysis could potentially identify her even if she'd successfully concealed her identity through traditional background checks. We need to consider the possibility that people are already making phone calls, Jake continued. Military aviation is a small community, and SEAL support operations are an even smaller community. If someone in that crashed pilot squadron recognizes your expertise or communication style, they might already be researching who you really are. Marcus looked between Sarah and Jake with the expression of someone trying to understand implications that exceeded his civilian experience. What exactly does that mean for Sarah and for this airport? It means, Sarah said quietly, that I need to be prepared for visitors who aren't just interested in emergency procedures or insurance liability. It means that people with access to classified databases are probably already running searches on Pine Ridge Regional Airport personnel, looking for someone with the qualifications to provide the kind of technical guidance I gave today. Tom. Bradley's face had grown progressively paler as the conversation revealed layers of complexity he'd never anticipated when he'd hired a competent flight instructor 15 years earlier. Sarah, I need to ask you directly. Is there any possibility that your past could create security issues for this airport or legal problems for the business? The question forced Sarah to confront realities she'd hoped never to face again. Her military service had involved operations that remained classified, relationships with intelligence agencies that might still consider her a person of interest, and knowledge of procedures and technologies that could attract unwanted attention from various government entities. I was never involved in anything illegal or unethical, she said carefully. But I did participate in operations that involved classified information, and I made enemies among people who blamed me for mission outcomes that were beyond my control. She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that everything she said might eventually be scrutinized by investigators. There's a possibility that my presence here could attract attention from people who would prefer that certain aspects of past operations remain undiscussed. The euphemistic language didn't disguise the serious implications of what Sarah was describing. Marcus, Tom, and Jake were intelligent enough to understand that she was discussing potential complications that could affect not just her personal situation, but the entire airport operation and everyone associated with it. Through the tower windows, they watched Captain Mitchell approaching the terminal building with two other officers whose bearing and equipment suggested they were involved in more than routine aircraft recovery. Their purposeful movement toward the airport's administrative offices indicated that Informal conversations were about to become official interviews. "They're coming here," Jake observed unnecessarily. Sarah straightened her shoulders with the unconscious posture adjustment of someone preparing for a confrontation she'd hoped to avoid but always knew might eventually arrive. "Tom, I think you should let me handle the initial conversation with Captain Mitchell. I can provide him with the information he needs about the emergency response without involving airport management in discussions about my background." Tom shook his head firmly. "Sarah, you're my employee, and this happened on my airport during an emergency response we coordinated. I'm not going to let you face military investigators alone, especially if there's any possibility of legal complications." His loyalty was touching, but Sarah recognized that civilian airport management wasn't equipped to handle the kind of investigation that might develop if her true identity became known. Military investigators operated under different rules and had access to information sources that could quickly transform a routine incident inquiry into something much more complex. "Tom, I appreciate your support, but you need to understand that military investigations can expand very quickly once they identify areas of interest. If Captain Mitchell discovers my background, this could become a multi-agency investigation involving people who don't care about protecting civilian airport operations." Marcus had been listening to the conversation with growing concern, but now he stepped forward with the decisive manner he used when making difficult flight instruction decisions. "Sarah, we're all in this together now. You used your expertise to prevent a disaster, and we're going to support you through whatever consequences that decision creates." Jake nodded agreement. "Besides, if investigators are going to discover your background anyway, it's better to be cooperative and transparent from the beginning. Trying to conceal information usually makes things worse when people with security clearances start asking questions." Sarah looked at her colleagues with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. For 15 years, these people had accepted her as a competent but unremarkable flight instructor. Now they were offering to stand with her as she faced the possibility of returning to a world that had nearly destroyed her psychologically. The sound of footsteps on the tower stairs indicated that Captain Mitchell and his officers were approaching. Sarah took a deep breath, mentally preparing for conversations that would inevitably lead to revelations she'd spent 15 years avoiding. "Whatever happens," she said quietly to her colleagues, "I want you to know that working here has been the most peaceful 15 years of my life. This place and these people gave me a chance to rebuild myself after I thought my career and my life were finished." Marcus placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, whatever you did before you came here, you've been an exemplary employee and a good friend. We're not going to abandon you now just because we're learning that you're more qualified than any of us realized." The control tower door opened to admit Captain Mitchell and 2 other officers whose insignia indicated they held positions of significant authority within their respective commands. Mitchell's expression was professional but curious, the look of someone who'd heard reports that didn't quite match his expectations about civilian airport capabilities. "Good afternoon," Mitchell began, his tone carrying the formal courtesy of military officers conducting official business. "I'm Captain David Mitchell, and these are Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes from Naval Intelligence and Major Robert Chun from Air Force Special Operations Command." He paused, studying the faces of the civilian airport personnel. "We're here to discuss the emergency response procedures that were implemented during today's incident." Sarah felt her chest tighten as she recognized the significance of having both Naval Intelligence and Air Force Special Operations representatives involved in what should have been a routine aircraft recovery mission. Their presence suggested that someone had already identified aspects of the emergency response that warranted investigation beyond normal accident procedures. "Captain Mitchell," she said, stepping forward to take the lead in the conversation. "I'm Sarah Parker, the instructor who provided technical guidance during your pilot's emergency approach. I'm prepared to answer any questions you have about the procedures we implemented." Mitchell's eyes sharpened with interest as he studied her more closely. "Ms. Parker, I've reviewed the radio transcripts from today's emergency, and I have to say that your technical guidance was exceptionally sophisticated. The terminology you used and the specific procedures you recommended suggest a level of familiarity with A-18 systems that goes well beyond standard civilian training." Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward with the kind of focused attention that Sarah remembered from intelligence briefings. "Ms. Parker, we'd like to understand how you acquired the knowledge to provide such specific technical guidance for military aircraft systems. Your instructions today demonstrated familiarity with classified flight procedures and emergency protocols." The moment Sarah had been dreading for 15 years had finally arrived. She was face to face with military investigators who possessed the resources and authority to uncover any aspect of her background they chose to investigate. Continued deception was impossible, but complete honesty could lead to consequences she wasn't prepared to handle. "I have military experience," she said carefully, "though it's been many years since I was on active duty." Major Chun consulted a tablet computer that probably contained preliminary research on Pine Ridge Regional Airport personnel. "Ms. Parker, our initial database searches haven't located any military service records under your current name. Could you help us understand what service branch you were affiliated with and what your military occupational specialty was?" Sarah realized that her legal name change had created exactly the kind of documentation gap that would trigger intensive investigation by people with access to classified databases. They would eventually correlate her current identity with her military service record, but the apparent discrepancy would raise questions about why she'd felt the need to obscure her background. "I served in the Navy," she said, making the decision to provide information gradually rather than volunteer details that might expand the scope of their investigation. "My specialty involved aviation operations." Captain Mitchell's expression grew more interested. "What type of aviation operations, Ms. Parker?" "Because the expertise you demonstrated today suggests experience with tactical flight procedures that aren't part of standard Navy aviation training." The conversation was progressing exactly as Sarah had feared, with each answer leading to more specific questions that would inevitably require her to reveal details she'd hoped to keep buried. She could see Marcus, Tom, and Jake watching the exchange with growing concern as they began to understand the complexity of the situation their colleague had been concealing. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was studying Sarah with the analytical intensity of someone trained to detect deception and evaluate security implications. "Ms. Parker, I think it would be helpful if we could continue this conversation in a more private setting. There are aspects of military aviation operations that aren't appropriate for discussion in the presence of personnel who lack appropriate security clearances." The suggestion that classified information might be involved sent a visible chill through the civilian airport personnel. Tom Bradley's expression reflected the growing realization that his employee's background might involve complications far beyond anything he'd anticipated when he'd authorized her to provide emergency technical guidance. "That's probably a good idea," Sarah agreed, recognizing that further attempts to limit the scope of discussion would only increase official suspicions about what she was trying to conceal. Major Chun gestured toward the stairs leading down from the control tower. "Ms. Parker, we've established a temporary command post near our aircraft, where we can discuss your background in an appropriate security environment. If you're willing, we'd like to ask you some detailed questions about your military service and how you acquired the expertise you demonstrated today." Sarah looked at her colleagues one final time, seeing support mixed with apprehension in their expressions. "I'll be back," she said, though she wasn't certain that promise could be kept. "Whatever happens, please remember that I never intended for any of this to affect the airport or any of you." Marcus stepped forward with the protective instinct of someone who'd supervised personnel for decades. "Sarah, you don't have to face this alone. If you need legal representation or any other kind of support, we're here to help." His offer touched her deeply, but Sarah recognized that civilian support might not be relevant for the kind of investigation she was about to face. Military personnel with appropriate security clearances operated under different rules and had access to information that could quickly resolve questions about her background and qualifications. "Thank you, Marcus," she said sincerely. "I'll be fine. I just need to answer their questions honestly and hope that 15 years of good citizenship counts for something." As she followed the military officers down the tower stairs and across the tarmac toward their command post, Sarah felt 15 years of carefully maintained anonymity dissolving with each step. The peaceful life she'd built in Oakville was about to be examined by people who had the authority and resources to uncover every detail of her past, including the traumatic events that had driven her to seek refuge in civilian obscurity. The temporary command post was a sophisticated mobile communications center that had been deployed from the transport aircraft with military efficiency. Inside, banks of computers and secure communication equipment created an environment that felt uncomfortably familiar to someone who'd once worked in similar facilities during classified operations around the world. Lieutenant Commander Hayes gestured for Sarah to take a seat at a table equipped with recording equipment and security monitoring devices. "Ms. Parker, before we begin our formal discussion, I want to assure you that we're not conducting a criminal investigation. Our purpose is to understand how you acquired the expertise you demonstrated today and to evaluate any security implications of your current civilian employment." The reassurance was professional but not entirely comforting. Sarah understood that military investigations could evolve rapidly depending on what information was discovered during initial interviews. Security implications could encompass a wide range of concerns, from protecting classified information to evaluating potential threats to ongoing operations. Captain Mitchell activated the recording equipment with practiced efficiency. "For the record, this is Captain David Mitchell conducting a preliminary interview with Sarah Parker regarding emergency response procedures implemented at Pine Ridge Regional Airport on today's date. Ms. Parker, you've been advised that this interview is being recorded for official purposes, and you've indicated your willingness to participate voluntarily." Sarah nodded her understanding, feeling the familiar weight of official scrutiny that she'd hoped never to experience again. "I understand, Captain Mitchell." Major Chun opened a laptop computer that displayed what appeared to be preliminary research on her background. "Ms. Parker, our initial database searches indicate that your current identity was established approximately 15 years ago through legal name change procedures in the state of Montana. Can you help us understand why you felt it necessary to change your name and relocate to this area?" The question struck directly at the heart of what Sarah had been trying to conceal for 15 years. She'd known this moment would eventually arrive, but facing it in an official military investigation environment brought back memories of other interviews, other questions, other consequences that had shaped the most difficult period of her life. 15 years ago, she began slowly, I was involved in military operations that resulted in casualties among personnel under my command. Although I was never formally charged with wrongdoing, the aftermath of those operations convinced me that continuing my military career would be detrimental to my psychological well-being and potentially dangerous to future personnel who might serve under my command. Lieutenant Commander Hayes leaned forward with increased interest. "Ms. Parker, can you be more specific about the nature of these operations and your role in the casualties you mentioned?" Sarah felt her chest tighten as suppressed memories threatened to surface. For 15 years, she'd managed to avoid detailed discussions of the events that had ended her military career. Now she was being asked to provide specific information to investigators who had the authority to access classified records and verify every detail of what she was about to reveal. "I was a pilot assigned to provide aviation support for Navy SEAL operations," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the admission. My role involved insertion and extraction missions in hostile environments where conventional aircraft couldn't operate effectively. Captain Mitchell's expression grew more focused as he began to understand the significance of what Sarah was describing. SEAL aviation support represented some of the most challenging and dangerous flying in the military, requiring skills and clearances that were granted only to exceptionally qualified personnel. What specific aircraft were you qualified to operate? Major Chun asked, consulting his laptop for what appeared to be classified information about SEAL aviation assets. Multiple platforms, Sarah replied carefully, including modified versions of standard military aircraft that were equipped for special operations missions. Lieutenant Commander Hayes exchanged meaningful glances with her colleagues, suggesting that they were beginning to correlate Sarah's admissions with classified information in their databases. Ms. Parker, SEAL aviation support operations typically require top-secret clearances and involve personnel who are tracked throughout their post-service careers. Can you help us understand how you were able to establish a civilian identity without triggering security monitoring systems? The question revealed that Sarah's attempt to disappear from official attention hadn't been as successful as she'd hoped. Security agencies apparently maintained some level of monitoring for personnel with her background, and her 15-year absence from official records had probably been noted by people responsible for tracking former special operations personnel. I followed all legal procedures for name change and relocation, she said, but I deliberately minimized my digital footprint and avoided activities that might attract official attention. Captain Mitchell studied her with the expression of someone trying to reconcile conflicting information. Ms. Parker, the expertise you demonstrated today suggests that your skills and knowledge remain at an extremely high level despite 15 years away from military aviation. That kind of proficiency typically requires ongoing training and practice that would be difficult to maintain in a civilian environment. Sarah realized that her performance during the emergency had revealed capabilities that were inconsistent with 15 years of civilian flight instruction. The technical precision and tactical thinking she demonstrated couldn't be easily explained without admitting that she'd been deliberately suppressing her true abilities throughout her civilian career. Some skills, she said carefully, are difficult to forget completely, even after years away from military service. Major Chun consulted his computer again, his expression suggesting that he was finding information that confirmed or expanded upon Sarah's admissions. Ms. Parker, our preliminary research suggests that you were involved in a classified operation approximately 15 years ago that resulted in significant casualties and led to congressional oversight hearings. Can you help us understand your role in those events? The question struck at the most painful memories of Sarah's military career. The operation Major Chun was referencing had been the defining tragedy of her service, the mission that had ended her career and driven her to seek refuge in civilian anonymity. She'd hoped never to discuss those events again, but military investigators with appropriate clearances had obviously accessed classified records that documented her involvement. There was a rescue operation, she began reluctantly, that encountered unexpected resistance and suffered casualties that might have been prevented if different tactical decisions had been made. Lieutenant Commander Hayes leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of what was being discussed. Ms. Parker, were you the mission commander for this operation? The question forced Sarah to confront the leadership responsibility that had haunted her for 15 years. She'd been the senior pilot on a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong, and although official investigations had cleared her of criminal wrongdoing, she'd never forgiven herself for the deaths that had resulted from her tactical decisions. I was the aviation element commander, she admitted, feeling 15 years of suppressed guilt and trauma threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained emotional control. Sarah stared at the blank wall of the military command post, her mind involuntarily transported back to a moonless night 15 years ago, when everything she'd believed about herself and her capabilities had been shattered by the sound of gunfire and the sight of smoke rising from what should have been a routine extraction point. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the same mechanical persistence that had accompanied countless debriefings in facilities just like this one. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't debriefing a successful mission or planning the next operation. Tonight, she was excavating the buried remains of a career that had ended in tragedy and a life that had required complete reconstruction. Lieutenant Commander Hayes waited patiently for Sarah to continue, her expression carrying the professional sympathy of someone who'd conducted similar interviews with personnel traumatized by classified operations. The recording equipment captured every pause, every breath, every moment of silence that revealed as much as spoken words about the psychological weight Sarah had been carrying for 15 years. The mission was designated Operation Nightfall, Sarah finally continued, her voice barely above a whisper. We were tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a compound in Taviz, Afghanistan that had been compromised by enemy forces. The extraction window was limited, and conventional helicopter support wasn't feasible due to the terrain and enemy air defenses in the area. Captain Mitchell consulted his secure tablet, apparently cross-referencing Sarah's account with classified mission records that confirmed the basic parameters of what she was describing. Ms. Parker, our records indicate that Operation Nightfall was a joint task force mission involving multiple special operations units. Can you describe your specific role in the operation? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, seeing again the pre-mission briefing room where she'd studied satellite imagery and weather reports, while SEAL team leaders outlined insertion and extraction procedures. She'd been confident then, certain that her skills and experience were sufficient to handle whatever challenges the mission might present. That confidence had lasted exactly 47 minutes after crossing into hostile airspace. I was flying a modified Black Hawk configured for stealth operations, she said, opening her eyes to focus on a point somewhere beyond the investigator's shoulders. My aircraft was designated as the primary extraction platform with 2 backup helicopters, providing overwatch and emergency support. The plan was to insert the SEAL team, allow them 30 minutes to locate and secure the intelligence asset, then extract all personnel to a forward operating base. Major Chun leaned forward with the intensity of someone who understood the complexity of the operation Sarah was describing. Special operations aviation in Afghanistan required navigation through mountain terrain while avoiding enemy radar, coordination with ground forces under combat conditions, and split-second decision-making. That could determine the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. What went wrong? He asked simply. The question struck at the heart of 15 years of self-recrimination and psychological analysis. Sarah had dissected every decision, every radio call, every tactical choice she'd made during those crucial minutes when Operation Nightfall had transformed from a routine extraction into a nightmare that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. Intelligence reports were incomplete, she began, her voice gaining strength as she shifted into the analytical mode that had once made her an effective military officer. The compound wasn't just compromised by enemy forces. It was actively being used as a command center for coordinating attacks against coalition forces in the region. Our insertion put the SEAL team directly into a heavily defended position, with significantly more enemy personnel than anticipated. Lieutenant Commander Hayes made notes on her secure tablet while maintaining eye contact with Sarah. How did you become aware that the intelligence was faulty? Radio chatter, Sarah replied immediately. Within 10 minutes of insertion, the team leader was reporting enemy contact that exceeded mission parameters. Instead of securing one intelligence asset in a lightly defended compound, they were facing organized resistance from what appeared to be a reinforced enemy unit with heavy weapons and coordinated defensive positions. Captain Mitchell's expression grew more focused as he began to understand the tactical dilemma Sarah had faced. Military aviation support for special operations required constant adaptation to changing ground conditions, but some situations developed beyond the point where tactical adjustments could compensate for fundamental mission planning failures. What options did you consider? He asked. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she remembered the radio calls that had forced her to make impossible decisions under combat conditions. The SEAL team had been requesting immediate extraction while enemy forces were attempting to surround their position. Conventional extraction procedures required securing a landing zone and providing covering fire for helicopter operations, but the enemy response had been too quick and too well coordinated for standard tactical solutions. I had 3 choices, she said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting facts that had been analyzed countless times. I could attempt extraction from the planned landing zone, which was under direct enemy fire and probably mined. I could abort the mission and leave the SEAL team to fight their way to an alternate extraction point, which would have meant abandoning the intelligence asset and probably resulted in team casualties during a running firefight through hostile territory. Or I could attempt an improvised extraction from an unsecured landing zone closer to the compound, which violated standard safety protocols but offered the best chance of getting everyone out alive. The 3 military investigators exchanged glances that suggested they understood the impossible nature of the decision Sarah had been forced to make. Special operations missions frequently required commanders to choose between bad options and worse options, with no guarantee that any choice would lead to successful outcomes. Which option did you choose? Major Chun asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer from classified mission reports. I chose the improvised extraction, Sarah said, her voice growing quieter as she approached the part of the story that still caused her physical pain 15 years later. I brought my aircraft into a landing zone that hadn't been secured under direct enemy fire with no backup plan if the approach failed. Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who understood the courage required for such a decision. Military pilots were trained to avoid unsecured landing zones under combat conditions, precisely because the risks to aircraft and personnel were typically unacceptable. Sarah's choice had represented either exceptional heroism or reckless endangerment, depending on the outcome. What happened during the extraction attempt? She asked. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly as suppressed memories forced their way to the surface. For 15 years, she'd managed to avoid detailed recollections of the sounds, sights, and sensations that had accompanied the worst moments of her military career. Now, facing official investigators in an environment that mimicked the debriefing rooms where she'd first been forced to confront the consequences of her decisions, those memories returned with devastating clarity. The approach was successful initially, she said, her voice barely audible. I was able to get the aircraft on the ground despite enemy fire, and the SEAL team began loading casualties and the intelligence asset. Everything seemed to be going according to the improvised plan until we took a rocket-propelled grenade hit to the tail rotor assembly. Captain Mitchell winced involuntarily. Tail rotor damage to a helicopter under combat conditions represented one of the most dangerous mechanical failures a pilot could face, particularly when the aircraft was loaded with personnel and operating in a confined landing zone under enemy fire. Were you able to maintain control of the aircraft? He asked. For approximately 30 seconds, Sarah replied. Long enough to get most of the SEAL team and the intelligence asset aboard, but not long enough to execute a controlled takeoff. The aircraft began spinning due to the tail rotor failure, and I had to make another impossible decision. Major Chun leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who understood that they were approaching the critical moment that had defined Sarah's career and shaped the subsequent 15 years of her life. What decision? Sarah closed her eyes again, seeing the faces of the men who had trusted her judgment during those final moments when mechanical failure had eliminated all good options and left only degrees of catastrophe to choose from. I could attempt to lift off with a damaged tail rotor, which would probably result in a crash that killed everyone aboard. I could shut down the engines and try to defend the landing zone until backup arrived, which would mean fighting aground. Battle against superior enemy forces with limited ammunition and no air support. Or I could order everyone off the aircraft and attempt to create a diversion that might give the SEAL team a chance to escape on foot. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stopped taking notes, her full attention focused on Sarah's account of decisions that had been made under combat conditions with incomplete information and no time for careful analysis. Military personnel understood that split-second choices under fire often determined who lived and who died. But that understanding didn't eliminate the psychological burden carried by those who made such decisions. I chose the diversion, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she moved toward the conclusion of a story she'd never told in complete detail to anyone. I ordered everyone off the aircraft, started the engines despite the tail rotor damage, and attempted to draw enemy fire away from the SEAL team's position by flying the damaged helicopter toward the enemy positions. Captain Mitchell consulted his tablet again, cross-referencing Sarah's account with official mission records that apparently contained different perspectives on the same events. Ms. Parker, our records indicate that your diversion was successful in allowing the SEAL team to reach an alternate extraction point where they were recovered by backup aircraft. The intelligence asset was successfully extracted, and the mission was ultimately classified as successful, despite the casualties that were incurred. The word casualties struck Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the human cost of her tactical decisions. For 15 years, she'd focused on the mission's success and the lives that had been saved, but she'd never been able to forget the names and faces of those who hadn't made it home. 3 members of my aircrew were killed when the helicopter crashed, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Sergeant Michael Torres, the crew chief, Corporal David Kim, the door gunner, and Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, my co-pilot. She paused, struggling with emotions that 15 years hadn't diminished. They died because I made the decision to fly a damaged aircraft into enemy fire instead of finding another way to create the diversion the SEAL team needed. Major Chun looked up from his computer with an expression that suggested he was finding information that provided additional context for Sarah's story. Ms. Parker, according to our records, all 3 of those personnel were posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for heroism during Operation Nightfall. The citation specifically mentions their voluntary participation in a diversionary action that saved the lives of the SEAL team and ensured the success of a critical intelligence extraction mission. The information should have provided some comfort, but Sarah had long since learned that official recognition didn't eliminate personal responsibility or reduce the psychological burden of command decisions that resulted in casualties. She'd been the aircraft commander, the person ultimately responsible for the safety of her crew and the success of the mission. No amount of posthumous medals could change the fact that 3 people had died following her orders. The official investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing, she said quietly. The findings stated that I had made reasonable tactical decisions under extreme circumstances, and that the casualties were the result of enemy action rather than command failure. But clearing someone of wrongdoing isn't the same as saying they made the right choices. Lieutenant Commander Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the analytical expression of someone who understood the complex psychological aftermath of combat leadership. Miss Parker, survivor guilt is common among military personnel who lose subordinates during combat operations, even when those losses aren't the result of command failures. Did you receive psychological counseling after Operation Nightfall? Extensive counseling, Sarah replied. both mandatory debriefings and voluntary therapy sessions with military psychologists specialized in combat trauma. Everyone assured me that I had performed admirably under impossible circumstances and that the casualties weren't my fault. She paused, meeting Hayes's gaze directly. But none of that changed the fact that 3 people who trusted my judgment were dead because of decisions I made. Captain Mitchell set aside his tablet and focused his full attention on Sarah. "Miss Parker, what led you to leave military service after Operation Nightfall? Your record indicates exemplary performance throughout your career, and the investigation cleared you of any wrongdoing related to the casualties." Sarah had anticipated this question, but answering it required her to articulate psychological and emotional concepts that were difficult to express in the analytical language favored by military investigators. Her decision to leave the Navy hadn't been based on career considerations or official pressure. It had been driven by the growing conviction that she could no longer trust herself to make life-and-death decisions for other people. "I realized that I couldn't continue serving in a capacity where my decisions might result in additional casualties," she said carefully. "Not because I was afraid of making mistakes, but because I was afraid of making the same kinds of calculated risks that had resulted in the deaths of Torres, Kim, and Walsh." Major Chun frowned with confusion. "Ms. Parker, calculated risks are inherent in special operations. Personnel who serve in those capacities understand and accept that some missions will result in casualties despite the best efforts of everyone involved." "Understanding and accepting are different things," Sarah replied. "I understood the nature of special operations when I volunteered for SEAL aviation support. I accepted the risks to my own life and the possibility that missions might fail, despite perfect execution. What I hadn't fully accepted was the psychological burden of being responsible for other people's deaths, even when those deaths weren't the result of personal failure or poor judgment." Lieutenant Commander Hayes nodded with the understanding of someone who'd counseled other military personnel struggling with similar psychological burdens. Combat leadership required individuals to make decisions that balanced mission objectives against personnel safety, often with incomplete information and under extreme time pressure. Not everyone who possessed the technical skills for such positions also possessed the psychological resilience to handle the emotional consequences of command decisions. "So you left the military to avoid situations where you might be responsible for additional casualties?" she asked. "I left the military because I realized that my judgment had been permanently compromised by the trauma of Operation Nightfall," Sarah said, her voice carrying 15 years of self-analysis and psychological insight. "Every subsequent mission briefing, every tactical decision, every moment of command responsibility was filtered through the memories of Torres, Kim, and Walsh dying because of choices I had made." Captain Mitchell leaned forward with increased interest. "Ms. Parker, that kind of psychological impact typically diminishes over time with proper counseling and gradual return to operational duties. Did you consider remaining in service and working through the trauma while continuing your career?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "I tried to return to operational status after the mandatory counseling period. I flew training missions, participated in mission planning exercises, and attempted to resume normal duties." She paused, remembering the growing anxiety and decision paralysis that had accompanied her attempted return to active operations. "But I found that I was second-guessing every tactical choice, avoiding necessary risks, and prioritizing crew safety over mission objectives in ways that could have compromised operational effectiveness." Major Chun consulted his computer again, apparently reviewing Sarah's service record for indications of performance issues following Operation Nightfall. "Ms. Parker, our records don't show any negative performance evaluations or mission failures during your attempted return to operational status, because I never allowed myself to reach the point where performance failures might occur," Sarah replied. "I requested transfer to training duties, then to administrative positions, and finally submitted my resignation when it became clear that I could no longer function effectively as an operational pilot. The admission revealed the depth of psychological damage that Operation Nightfall had inflicted on someone who'd previously been a highly effective military officer. Sarah's decision to leave the Navy hadn't been driven by external pressure or career limitations. It had been the result of honest self-assessment that concluded she could no longer perform the duties she'd once excelled at. Lieutenant Commander Hayes made additional notes while processing the implications of what Sarah had revealed. "Miss Parker, your decision to leave military service under those circumstances was probably appropriate given your psychological state at the time. But it's unusual for personnel with your qualifications and security clearances to completely disappear from official attention for 15 years. Sarah felt the conversation shifting toward aspects of her post-military life that she'd hoped to keep private. Her decision to change her name and relocate to Montana had been motivated by the desire to escape not just military service but the entire world of aviation and tactical decision-making that reminded her of Operation Nightfall. "I needed to rebuild my identity in an environment that didn't constantly remind me of my military service," she said. Flying civilian aircraft in a small Montana town seemed like a way to maintain some connection to aviation while avoiding the tactical and command responsibilities that had become psychologically impossible for me. Captain Mitchell studied her with the expression of someone trying to understand motivations that were outside his personal experience. "Miss Parker, your expertise today in guiding our pilot through his emergency approach suggests that your skills and knowledge have remained at an extremely high level despite 15 years away from military aviation. How do you reconcile that maintained expertise with your statement that you could no longer handle tactical decision-making?" The question struck at the heart of Sarah's psychological struggle over the past 15 years. Her technical knowledge and piloting skills had remained sharp through continued civilian flying. But her confidence in making command decisions under pressure had never recovered from the trauma of Operation Nightfall. "Technical expertise and command psychology are different things," she said. "I can still analyze aircraft systems, understand emergency procedures, and provide technical guidance based on knowledge and experience. But making decisions that might result in casualties, accepting responsibility for other people's lives, trusting my judgment in life and death situations, those capabilities were permanently damaged by Operation Nightfall." Major Chun looked up from his computer with an expression that suggested he was finding information that contradicted Sarah's self-assessment. "Miss Parker, your actions today demonstrate that you were willing to accept responsibility for our pilot's life when you provided guidance for his emergency approach. That suggests your command psychology may have recovered more than you realize." The observation forced Sarah to consider aspects of her behavior that she hadn't fully analyzed. Her decision to guide the Navy pilot through his emergency approach had indeed required her to accept responsibility for someone else's life, to trust her judgment in a life-and-death situation, and to make tactical decisions under pressure. For the first time in 15 years, she'd functioned effectively in exactly the kind of situation she'd believed she could no longer handle. "I didn't think about it in those terms at the time," she admitted. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I had the knowledge to provide that help." Lieutenant Commander Hayes leaned forward with renewed interest. "Miss Parker, that's exactly the kind of instinctive response we look for in effective military leaders. The ability to set aside personal psychological barriers when the mission requires decisive action." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she considered the implications of what the investigators were suggesting. For 15 years, she'd defined herself as someone who could no longer handle command responsibility, someone whose judgment had been permanently compromised by combat trauma. The possibility that her capabilities might have recovered through time and civilian experience was both hopeful and terrifying. "Even if that's true," she said carefully, It doesn't change the fact that I've been living under an assumed identity for 15 years while avoiding the kind of official monitoring that personnel with my background typically receive. Captain Mitchell nodded acknowledgement of the administrative complexities that Sarah's case presented. Ms. Parker, we're going to need to coordinate with various agencies to regularize your status and ensure that security protocols are properly maintained. But based on what we've learned today, it appears that you've been living as a law-abiding civilian while maintaining capabilities that could be valuable to ongoing military operations. The suggestion that her skills might still be militarily relevant sent a chill through Sarah's chest. For 15 years, she'd carefully avoided any situation that might lead to offers of return to military service. The peaceful life she'd built in Oakville represented everything she'd hoped to achieve when she'd left the Navy. Meaningful work without life and death responsibilities, genuine relationships without the emotional barriers required for military leadership, and daily routines that didn't require constant preparation for combat operations. "I'm not interested in returning to military service," she said firmly. "I've built a life here that doesn't involve tactical decision-making or command responsibilities, and I intend to maintain that life regardless of what capabilities I may or may not have recovered." Major Chun exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "Ms. Parker, we're not necessarily talking about full-time military service. There are various consulting and advisory positions that utilize the expertise of former special operations personnel without requiring return to active duty status." The suggestion revealed that the investigators had already begun considering ways to utilize Sarah's capabilities for ongoing military purposes. Her expertise in SEAL aviation support represented knowledge and experience that couldn't be easily replaced, particularly given the specialized nature of the operations she'd once supported. "What kind of consulting positions?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Lieutenant Commander Hayes consulted her tablet before responding. "Training programs for military pilots transitioning to special operations aviation. Technical consultation on aircraft modifications for special operations missions. Emergency response planning for military aviation operations in civilian environments." She paused, meeting Sarah's gaze directly. "The kind of expertise you demonstrated today isn't common, Ms. Parker. There are ongoing operations that could benefit from your knowledge and experience." Sarah realized that her attempt to help the Navy pilot had demonstrated capabilities that were now being viewed as military assets that should be utilized for national security purposes. The peaceful anonymity she'd maintained for 15 years was being replaced by official recognition that could lead to exactly the kind of responsibilities she'd fled 15 years earlier. "I need time to consider any proposals you might want to make," she said carefully. "My life here in Oakville is important to me, and I'm not willing to abandon it for opportunities that might recreate the psychological pressures I've spent 15 years recovering from." Captain Mitchell nodded with understanding. "Ms. Parker, we're not asking for an immediate decision about future opportunities, but we do need to complete our investigation of today's incident and ensure that proper security protocols are followed regarding your background and current civilian employment." The reminder that she was still subject to an ongoing military investigation brought Sarah back to the immediate concerns that had initiated this conversation. Her attempt to help had triggered official scrutiny that could affect not just her own life but the lives of everyone associated with Pine Ridge Regional Airport. "What does that mean for the people I work with?" she asked. Marcus, Jake, and Tom had no knowledge of my military background, and they shouldn't face any consequences for my decisions. Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked up from her notes with an expression that suggested she understood Sarah's concern for her civilian colleagues. "Ms. Parker, our investigation will focus on security protocols and emergency response procedures rather than personnel actions by civilian airport staff. However, We will need to interview your colleagues to ensure that proper procedures are followed and that no security breaches have occurred. The prospect of subjecting her friends and colleagues to military investigation interviews added another layer of guilt. Sarah's growing sense that her past was contaminating the peaceful life she'd built in Montana. Marcus, Jake, and Tom would be questioned about her background, her behavior, and her qualifications in ways that would permanently change their perception of who she was and what she represented. "They're good people who gave me a chance when I needed one," she said quietly. "I hope your investigation won't create problems for them or for the airport operation." Major Chun closed his laptop and prepared to conclude the interview. "Ms. Parker, based on what we've learned today, it appears that you've been living as a productive civilian while maintaining capabilities that were developed through extensive military training. Our investigation will focus on ensuring that proper security protocols are maintained going forward rather than punishing anyone for past decisions." The reassurance was professional, but not entirely comforting. Sarah understood that military investigations could evolve unpredictably, and the involvement of multiple agencies suggested that her case had implications beyond routine security clearance maintenance. "What happens next?" she asked. "Captain." Mitchell stood to indicate that the formal interview was concluding. "We'll continue our investigation over the next few days, including interviews with your civilian colleagues and coordination with various security agencies. We'll also be evaluating potential opportunities for utilizing your expertise in ways that might be mutually beneficial." Sarah rose from her chair, feeling 15 years of emotional distance from military culture beginning to dissolve despite her efforts to maintain psychological barriers. The familiar environment of the command post, the analytical conversation about tactical decisions, and the suggestion that her capabilities might still be militarily relevant were reactivating aspects of her identity that she'd worked hard to suppress. "When will I know the results of your investigation?" she asked. Lieutenant Commander Hayes gathered her notes and secured her tablet before responding. "We should have preliminary findings within 48 hours, Ms. Parker. In the meantime, we'd appreciate it if you remained available for additional questions and avoided discussing the details of our conversation with unauthorized personnel." The request to limit discussion of the interview was standard security protocol, but it added another layer of isolation to Sarah's growing sense that her carefully constructed civilian life was being systematically dismantled by forces beyond her control. As the investigators escorted her from the command post back toward the airport terminal, Sarah felt the weight of 15 years of suppressed identity pressing against the persona she'd developed as a civilian flight instructor, the woman who'd spent the morning teaching weekend pilots basic flight maneuvers was being forced to confront the military officer she'd once been and might still be capable of becoming again. The walk across the tarmac gave her time to observe the ongoing military activity surrounding the recovered A-18. Technical personnel were conducting detailed inspections of the aircraft systems, while security teams maintained perimeters. That excluded civilian airport personnel from areas they normally had unrestricted access to. The transformation of Pine Ridge Regional Airport from civilian facility to military operation zone represented exactly the kind of disruption Sarah had spent 15 years trying to avoid. As they approached the terminal building, she could see Marcus, Jake, and Tom waiting near the entrance with expressions that mixed concern, curiosity, and growing apprehension about the implications of her extended interview with military investigators. Their loyalty and support meant everything to her, but she realized that protecting them from the consequences of her past might require making choices that could end the relationships that had sustained her through 15 years of civilian life. The next few days would determine whether Sarah Michelle Parker, civilian flight instructor, could continue to exist alongside the emerging recognition that Lieutenant Sarah Patterson, former Navy SEAL aviation specialist, might never have been as completely buried as she'd hoped. Standing at the threshold between her carefully constructed civilian identity and the military world that was reclaiming her, Sarah realized that some transformations were irreversible once they began. The woman who'd hidden in Montana for 15 years was about to discover whether the person she'd become was strong enough to integrate the person she'd once been, or whether the collision between past and present would destroy the life she'd worked so hard to build. The 48 hours following Sarah's interview with military investigators passed with the surreal quality of watching her carefully constructed world transform in slow motion. Pine Ridge Regional Airport had become a hub of activity that attracted attention from agencies she'd hoped never to encounter again. Federal Aviation Administration officials arrived to review emergency response protocols. Department of Defense security specialists conducted comprehensive background investigations on all airport personnel. Most troubling of all, representatives from the Defense Intelligence Agency established a temporary office in the airport's conference room, their presence suggesting that Sarah's case had implications extending far beyond routine security clearance. Maintenance. Marcus Thompson found himself in the uncomfortable position of answering detailed questions about an employee he realized he'd never truly known. The investigators were professional but thorough, requesting employment records, performance evaluations, and personal observations about Sarah's behavior over 15 years of civilian service. Their questions revealed the extent to which her military background had been concealed, not through deception, but through careful omission of information that would have fundamentally changed how she was perceived by her civilian colleagues. Did Miss Parker ever demonstrate knowledge or skills that seemed inconsistent with standard civilian flight training? Agent Patricia Wells from the Defense Intelligence Agency asked during Marcus's formal interview. Marcus considered the question. While reviewing 15 years of interactions with someone he'd regarded as competent but unremarkable, Sarah always seemed to understand aircraft systems better than most instructors, he admitted. She could diagnose mechanical problems that other people missed, and she had an intuitive grasp of flight dynamics that impressed even experienced pilots. But I attributed that to natural talent and extensive study rather than military training I knew nothing about. Agent Wells made notes while maintaining the neutral expression of someone trained to evaluate information without revealing their conclusions. Were there any incidents or situations where Miss Parker's responses seemed unusual or disproportionate to civilian circumstances? The question prompted Marcus to recall subtle behaviors that had seemed merely quirky at the time, but now appeared to reflect military training and combat experience. Sarah's hypervigilance during airport security exercises, her instinctive awareness of exit routes and potential threats, her calm responses to emergency situations that stressed other personnel, all characteristics that made sense when viewed through the lens of special operations background. She never panicked, Marcus said slowly. In 15 years, I never saw Sarah lose her composure during emergencies or high-pressure situations. She would become very focused and analytical, almost detached, in ways that helped her make good decisions but sometimes seemed emotionally disconnected from the human elements of whatever crisis we were facing. Jake Rodriguez faced similar questioning, but his military background allowed him to recognize aspects of Sarah's behavior that Marcus had missed. Agent Wells, looking back with the knowledge I have now, there were definitely signs that Sarah had extensive tactical training, he said during his interview. Her situational awareness was exceptional. Her understanding of aircraft performance under extreme conditions was sophisticated, and her communication style during emergencies was remarkably similar to military protocol. Agent Wells leaned forward with increased interest. Can you provide specific examples of military-style communication or behavior? Jake consulted notes he'd prepared before the interview, recognizing that his observations might be crucial for understanding the security implications of Sarah's civilian employment. During aircraft emergencies, she would automatically establish clear command hierarchies, Use precise terminology that minimized ambiguity, and make tactical decisions that prioritized mission completion over individual safety concerns. Those aren't typical civilian responses to crisis situations. The observation struck at the heart of what made Sarah's case so unusual. Her civilian persona had been carefully constructed to conceal military training, but the fundamental patterns of thought and behavior developed through special operations experience couldn't be completely suppressed. Under pressure, she reverted to military decision-making processes that revealed the depth of her professional background. Tom Bradley's interview focused on administrative and legal concerns that could affect the airport's operations and insurance coverage. Agent Wells, I need to understand whether Sarah's background creates liability issues for Pine Ridge Regional Airport, he said directly. Our insurance policies, federal operating certificates, and local business licenses were all obtained based on accurate information about our personnel and capabilities. If Sarah's military background was concealed, we could face regulatory problems that threatened the entire operation. Agent Wells consulted her tablet before responding. Mr. Bradley, our preliminary investigation suggests that Ms. Parker followed legal procedures for name change and identity documentation. Her civilian employment appears to have been legitimate, and there's no evidence of security violations or regulatory infractions. However, we are evaluating whether her military background should have been disclosed for security purposes. The reassurance was qualified in ways that left Tom uncertain about the long-term implications for his business. Federal agencies were notorious for changing their conclusions as investigations developed, and the involvement of multiple security organizations suggested that Sarah's case was more complex than routine background verification. What happens if your investigation determines that disclosure should have occurred? Tom asked. That would depend on the specific findings and recommendations from various agencies, Agent Wells replied diplomatically. Our primary concern is ensuring that proper security protocols are maintained going forward, rather than punishing anyone for past omissions. While her colleagues endured official scrutiny, Sarah found herself in a strange limbo of anticipation and dread. She continued her normal duties at the airport, teaching flight lessons and maintaining aircraft, but the presence of federal investigators and military personnel transformed every routine interaction into a potential security concern. Students who'd trained with her for years suddenly viewed her with curiosity and suspicion, wondering what other secrets their mild-mannered instructor might be concealing. The psychological isolation was familiar from her military service when operational. Security requirements had created barriers between her professional and personal identities. But 15 years of civilian life had weakened her tolerance for the emotional distance that security classifications demanded. She'd grown accustomed to genuine relationships, based on mutual trust and shared experiences rather than the compartmentalized interactions that military service required. On the second evening after her initial interview, Sarah received a phone call that shattered any remaining hope that her situation might be resolved quietly through routine administrative procedures. The caller identified himself as Admiral James Harrison, Deputy Director of Naval Special Warfare Command, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security policy. Lieutenant Patterson, Admiral Harrison began, using her former rank and name in a way that immediately transported her back to military protocol and hierarchy. I've reviewed the reports from Captain Mitchell's investigation, and I think it's time we had a comprehensive discussion about your current situation and potential future opportunities. The use of her military rank after 15 years of civilian identity felt like being addressed by a name she'd almost forgotten belonged to her. Admiral Harrison, I appreciate your interest, but I've built a life here in Montana that I'm not willing to abandon for military opportunities. Lieutenant, I understand your attachment to civilian life, But I think you may be underestimating the significance of what occurred during that A-18 emergency. Your expertise saved not just our pilot and aircraft, but potentially prevented a catastrophic incident that could have affected national security operations. Admiral Harrison's voice carried the persuasive tone of someone skilled at recruiting personnel for sensitive assignments. We have ongoing situations that require precisely the kind of experience and judgment you demonstrated. Sarah felt familiar pressure building as military authority figures began treating her civilian preferences as obstacles to be overcome, rather than legitimate personal choices to be respected. Admiral, my service record should indicate that I left the Navy because I could no longer handle the psychological pressures of operational duties. That situation hasn't changed, regardless of what capabilities I may have demonstrated during a single emergency. Lieutenant, psychological assessments from 15 years ago may not accurately reflect your current capabilities, particularly given how effectively you function during a high-pressure situation involving life-and-death decisions. Modern military psychology recognizes that combat trauma can resolve over time with proper support and gradual re-engagement with professional duties. The suggestion that her psychological barriers might have diminished was both hopeful and terrifying. Sarah had built her civilian identity around the assumption that she was permanently incapable of military leadership, and any evidence to the contrary threatened the fundamental assumptions about herself that had guided 15 years of life choices. Even if that's true, Admiral, I'm not interested in discovering whether my psychological recovery is sufficient for military service. I've found meaning and satisfaction in civilian work that doesn't involve tactical decision-making or command responsibilities. Admiral Harrison's pause suggested he was consulting information that provided context for Sarah's resistance to military re-engagement. Lieutenant, I've reviewed the classified files regarding Operation Nightfall, and I want you to know that recent intelligence has provided additional perspective on that mission's outcome and your role in its tactical development. The mention of new intelligence regarding Operation Nightfall sent a chill through Sarah's chest. For 15 years, she'd carried the psychological burden of believing that different tactical choices might have prevented the casualties that had ended her military career. The possibility that new information might change her understanding of those events was both compelling and frightening. What kind of additional perspective? She asked, despite her reluctance to revisit the most traumatic period of her military service. Intelligence developed through subsequent operations in that region indicates that the compound you were tasked with infiltrating was being used as a coordination center for attacks against coalition forces throughout the province. The enemy response to your insertion was so rapid and well coordinated because they had been planning to use Operation Nightfall as an opportunity to eliminate an elite American Special Operations team. Sarah's hands began to tremble as she processed the implications of what Admiral Harrison was revealing. If the enemy had been prepared for their arrival, then the casualties suffered during Operation Nightfall weren't the result of tactical miscalculations or command failures. They were the inevitable consequence of walking into a carefully prepared ambush that had been designed to maximize American losses. Are you saying that Operation Nightfall was compromised from the beginning? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We're saying that intelligence failures at levels far above your command authority created a tactical situation where casualties were unavoidable regardless of the decisions you made during the operation. Your tactical choices, including the decision to attempt an improvised extraction under fire, were not just reasonable under the circumstances. They were the only options that offered any possibility of mission success. The information struck at the foundation of 15 years of self-recrimination and psychological trauma. Sarah had spent decades believing that better tactical judgment might have prevented the deaths of Torres, Kim, and Walsh, but Admiral Harrison was suggesting that their deaths had been predetermined by intelligence failures and enemy preparation that were completely outside her control. Why wasn't this information available during the original investigation? She asked. Because the intelligence sources that revealed the enemy preparation for Operation Nightfall weren't developed until several years after the mission, and the personnel involved in that investigation had moved on to other assignments or left military service. Your case file was closed, and there was no mechanism for updating findings based on subsequently developed intelligence. Sarah realized that she'd been carrying psychological trauma based on incomplete information about events that had been beyond her control from the beginning. The guilt and self-doubt that had driven her to leave military service had been grounded in assumptions about her tactical performance that were contradicted by intelligence that hadn't been available at the time. Admiral, assuming this new intelligence is accurate, it doesn't change the fact that I made the decision to leave military service because I believed I could no longer handle command responsibilities. Even if my judgment during Operation Nightfall was sound, I spent 15 years convinced that it wasn't, and that psychological experience has shaped who I've become. Admiral Harrison's voice carried the patience of someone accustomed to counseling military personnel through complex psychological transitions. Lieutenant, part of military leadership involves adapting to new information and adjusting previous assumptions based on improved understanding of tactical situations. The intelligence we've developed regarding Operation Nightfall provides you with an opportunity to reconsider conclusions you reached about your own capabilities and psychological readiness for continued service. The conversation was moving toward exactly the kind of military re-engagement that Sarah had been avoiding for 15 years, but she found herself genuinely curious about opportunities that might utilize her expertise without requiring her to resume full military duties. What specific opportunities are you considering? We have several consulting positions that would allow you to maintain your civilian employment while providing specialized expertise for training programs and tactical development projects. You could work with military pilots transitioning to special operations aviation, help develop emergency response protocols for operations in civilian environments, and provide technical consultation on aircraft modifications for special operations missions. The proposal sounded reasonable and professionally appealing, but Sarah had learned to be wary of military assignments that seemed limited in scope, but gradually expanded to encompass full-time responsibilities. Admiral, I would need absolute guarantees that any consulting work would remain part-time and wouldn't interfere with my civilian employment or personal life in Montana. Those guarantees can be provided, Lieutenant. We're not interested in forcing personnel back into full-time military service against their preferences. We're interested in utilizing expertise that could benefit national security while respecting the life choices that former military personnel have made. Sarah realized that she was being presented with an opportunity to integrate her military expertise with her civilian identity in ways that might resolve the psychological conflicts that had shaped 15 years of her life. Instead of completely suppressing her military background or completely abandoning her civilian identity, she could find ways to utilize both aspects of her experience for meaningful purposes. Admiral, I would be willing to consider consulting opportunities that meet those criteria, but I would need detailed proposals that specify exactly what would be required and what guarantees would be provided regarding the scope and duration of any assignments. Excellent, Lieutenant. We'll prepare comprehensive proposals for your review within the next week. In the meantime, I want you to know that the Navy recognizes the value of your civilian experience and the importance of respecting the life you've built in Montana. We're not asking you to abandon that life. We're asking you to enhance it by sharing expertise that could save lives and advance national security objectives. As the conversation concluded, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions that she hadn't experienced since leaving military service 15 years earlier. The revelation about Operation Nightfall had lifted a psychological burden that had shaped her civilian identity, But it had also reopened questions about her capabilities and potential contributions that she'd thought were permanently resolved. Over the following days, as federal investigators completed their background checks and military personnel prepared their final reports, Sarah found herself reconsidering assumptions about herself and her future that had seemed fixed for 15 years. The woman who'd believed she was psychologically incapable of military leadership was being forced to acknowledge that her self-assessment had been based on incomplete information about events that had been beyond her control. Marcus, Jake, and Tom rallied around her with loyalty that touched her deeply, but also highlighted how her deception had affected people who considered her a friend. They assured her that her military background didn't change their opinion of her character or their appreciation for her contributions to the airport, but she could see the curiosity and questions in their expressions when they thought she wasn't looking. The resolution came during a final meeting with Captain Mitchell, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, and Major Chun, who presented their official findings in the airport conference room that had served as an impromptu military command center. For nearly a week, Ms. Parker, Captain Mitchell began, using her civilian name in recognition of her legal identity and personal preferences. Our investigation has concluded that your civilian employment has been completely legitimate and that no security violations have occurred during your 15 years in Montana. Your background has been properly documented with appropriate agencies, and your current security clearance status has been updated to reflect your civilian employment and consulting availability. Lieutenant Commander Hayes continued the briefing with information about opportunities that had been developed based on her demonstrated expertise. Ms. Parker, we've prepared several consulting proposals that would allow you to maintain your civilian employment while providing specialized expertise for military training and development programs. These positions would be strictly voluntary, part-time, and designed to complement rather than replace your civilian career. Major Chun concluded with administrative details that formalized her transition from complete civilian anonymity to recognized military consultant with appropriate security clearances and official recognition. Ms. Parker, your service record has been updated to reflect the new intelligence regarding Operation Nightfall, and your personnel file now includes commendations for exceptional service under extreme circumstances. The psychological barriers that led to your departure from military service appear to have been based on incomplete information that has now been corrected. Sarah accepted the official recognition with gratitude, but also with the understanding that her quiet life as a civilian flight instructor was permanently changed. She would always be Sarah Michelle Parker, Montana flight instructor, but she would also be Lieutenant Sarah Patterson, former Navy SEAL aviation specialist and current military consultant. The integration of her dual identities required psychological adjustments that were both challenging and liberating. For 15 years, she'd suppressed aspects of herself that represented competence, leadership, and technical expertise in favor of a more modest civilian persona that avoided attention and responsibility. Now she could acknowledge her full range of capabilities while maintaining the relationships and geographical stability that had sustained her through the most difficult period of her life. 6 months later, Pine Ridge Regional Airport had evolved into something unique in American aviation. Sarah's consulting work with military training programs had attracted funding and attention that transformed the modest civilian airport into a joint training facility where military pilots learned to operate in civilian environments, while civilian pilots gained exposure to advanced aviation techniques. Marcus Thompson found himself managing an operation that combined civilian flight training with military consulting in ways that created opportunities for both communities. Sarah, when you first arrived here 15 years ago, I thought I was hiring a competent flight instructor. I never imagined I was hiring someone who would eventually transform this place into a nationally recognized training center. Jake Rodriguez had been accepted into an advanced military aviation program that would prepare him for special operations support duties, fulfilling career ambitions he'd never believed were achievable through civilian training. Sarah, working with you, taught me that expertise comes in many forms, and that the most valuable teachers are often the ones who understand both theoretical knowledge and practical application. Tom Bradley had watched his modest airport operation expand into a financially successful enterprise that served both civilian and military training needs while maintaining the community character that made Oakville a special place to live and work. Sarah, you brought expertise and opportunities to this community that we never could have imagined. But more importantly, you showed us that excellence can exist in quiet places, and that the most valuable contributions often come from people who don't seek recognition. Sarah's consulting work involved developing training programs that integrated civilian and military aviation techniques, creating emergency response protocols that could be used in diverse operational environments, and mentoring pilots who were transitioning between civilian and military careers. The work was professionally satisfying and psychologically healing, allowing her to utilize her military expertise for constructive purposes without the command responsibilities that had become psychologically impossible after Operation Nightfall. Most importantly, she had learned to integrate the person she'd been with the person she'd become, acknowledging her military background while maintaining the civilian relationships and geographical stability that had sustained her through 15 years of rebuilding her identity. The woman who'd once believed she had to choose between military competence and civilian peace had discovered that both aspects of her experience could coexist and complement each other in ways that enhanced rather than diminished her contributions to both communities. Standing in the control tower of Pine Ridge Regional Airport, watching military and civilian aircraft share the same airspace under her coordination and guidance, Sarah realized that some journeys required temporary detours that seemed like permanent destinations until circumstances revealed them to be preparation for missions that hadn't yet been imagined. The 15 years she'd spent hiding in Montana hadn't been a retreat from her true calling. They had been training for a role that required both military expertise and civilian wisdom, both technical competence and community connection, both individual excellence and collaborative leadership. The sound of jet engines overhead no longer triggered anxiety or memories of trauma. Instead, it represented the integration of past experience with present purpose, the synthesis of military capability with civilian values, and the transformation of personal healing into community service. Sarah Michelle Parker had found a way to honor Lieutenant Sarah Patterson without abandoning the life and relationships that had made that integration possible. The A-18 Super Hornet that had triggered her emergence from 15 years of anonymity now served as a symbol not of disruption and exposure but of opportunity and renewal. Sometimes the most significant transformations began with emergencies that forced people to reveal capabilities they'd forgotten they possessed. And sometimes the most meaningful contributions came from individuals who'd learned that true strength emerged not from avoiding difficult situations, but from developing the wisdom and resilience to handle them with grace. In the end, Sarah had discovered that hiding her Navy SEAL past hadn't been about escaping her identity. It had been about preparing for a future where that identity could serve purposes she'd never imagined while living in a community that appreciated her for who she'd become rather than who she'd once been. The woman who'd spent 15 years believing she was too damaged for military service had learned that healing sometimes required accepting help from others, but it always required the courage to help others when the need arose and the expertise was available. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.